About a year ago, I released this video, in which I analyzed the Trump admin's departure from the status quo of the last few decades of US imperialist policy in an effort to explain the direction that they were hoping to head in. Not to brag, but in retrospect, almost all of the predictions I made proved accurate. Frankly, that's just what happens when you ignore all the words spouted at you by the political and media classes and the capitalist vampires who own them, and instead focus on the real motivating forces of society, namely money and class interest. Today, I'm going to be revisiting that analysis in an effort to shed some light on the future we're barreling headlong towards. Also, because this is timely, the visual production value will be lower. Forgive me. Hello and welcome to Simply Radical, your personal ticket to understandable radical left-wing theory. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you'll stick around for a bit. Most of my videos here are summaries of books written by authors better informed than me, from an MLM perspective. Sometimes I also make videos about specific ideas or events. If you've got a suggestion for me, please drop it in the comments. I'm always looking for y'all's feedback. If you want to keep up to date with my latest videos, go ahead and click that subscribe button below, and if you're a freak, you can even click the bell icon for notifications. Alright, without further ado, let's get this shit show on the road. If you haven't seen that old video, I demand that you stop this one and go watch it right this second. I'll know if you don't, Dave. The Stasi are watching you. The TLDR, though, is this. 1. The Trump admin is retreating from its imperial presence in much of the world, specifically Eastern Europe, and the systems of power previously used to maintain that presence. 2. This retreat isn't being undertaken to dismantle the US imperial system, but rather to rein it into a more defensible position in light of other rising regional powers. 3. In those places where US imperial presence is maintained, it is actually expanding, moving from informal and covert imperial presence to open and outright imperial aggression. And lastly, as the US's imperial sphere of influence shrinks, class contradictions at home will heighten, and the systems of imperial coercion will increasingly be deployed domestically as well. All of these predictions have been borne out in the last year or so, as I'm sure you've no doubt noticed. As of January 7th, 2026, the Trump admin has announced 66 international organizations that they will be withdrawing the US from. Many of these are no doubt motivated by the money that funds him, such as big oil working to pull the US from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, while others are no doubt designed to shield agents of US imperialism from the repercussions of their actions, such as the UN's International Law Commission, and still others are designed to separate the US from the EU's imperial system, in which it had previously been partnered. An example of this would perhaps be the UN's International Trade Center, an organization that works with the World Trade Organization to push neoliberalism on developing economies to the benefit of firms based in developed countries. The Trump admin has also gone so far as to begin to build new systems of imperial domination with total control being given to the US, rather than shared with other imperial blocs like the EU. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is the so-called Board of Peace, an international organization along the lines of the UN that names Trump specifically as chairman for life, reserves the only veto power specifically for the US, and has staffed the 7-person executive board with 4 US government officials, with the remaining minority being US state-affiliated actors from US vassal states. Membership on the board also requires countries to pay the US $1 billion, ostensibly to quote-unquote rebuild, read colonize, but more likely to be used as additional leverage over member states. That money also buys a permanent seat on the council, meaning are meant never to be handed sovereignty of their own land. That's not it though. US imperialism has actually become more overtly aggressive and violent in those places in which it has decided to remain, namely in the Western Hemisphere. Remember the Monroe Doctrine I mentioned in the last video? Yeah, now they want us to call it the Donroe Doctrine, because the evilest ghouls on the planet are also the lamest, least creative fucking morons you could possibly imagine. Like I mentioned before, this began with threats towards Canada, Mexico, and Greenland, all of which have persisted and escalated, with Trump meeting with Alberta separatists to discuss US annexation, as well as continued efforts to seize the Panama Canal, Greenland, and most theatrically, to kidnap the president of Venezuela. Colombia has also recently been a target of US imperial aggression, with airstrikes being undertaken in Colombian territorial waters and threats of outright military action being made against sitting President Gustavo Petro. All of this I would expect to continue, given the continued explicit threats leveled by the Trump admin against Canada, Greenland, Panama, and Colombia. The exact forms this will take will remain to be seen, but given the developments thus far, I would keep a close eye on strategic infrastructure and resources in the region. Oil from Venezuela, Colombia, and Alberta, of course, but also rare earth minerals in the rest of Canada, Colombia, and Greenland, which are becoming increasingly necessary for high-tech and weapons manufacturing, both huge industries in the US. Clean energy also requires rare earth metals, and while that industry remains suppressed in the US due to big oil's financial sway, there is still much money to be made by selling those metals to other countries. Finally, strategic infrastructure in the region is also likely to be a target. Most obviously, perhaps, the Panama Canal, an explicit target of the US government, but also, as sea ice melts, the emerging Northwest Passage between what is now Canada and Greenland will become an increasingly valuable sea lane to control. No doubt this is a large motivator for recent US aggression in the area. This will continue, whether it takes the form of outright invasion, covert operations, fomenting civil unrest, or simply corruption, until Trump's administration accomplishes its strategic goals in the area. Given widespread resistance to US annexation, I imagine invasion to be the least likely scenario, but if Europe refuses to support Canada, it is a possibility. Greenland, given its very small population, is more likely to be militarily occupied, but given the US military already has wide-ranging latitude on the island, I don't think it's necessary to accomplish what they want. Strategic infrastructure will also increasingly be targeted not only for the benefits it provides to the US, but for the destabilization of uncooperative third countries. A great example of this is again the Venezuelan oil industry, which underpinned much of the Cuban electrical grid. Since the illegal US kidnapping of President Maduro, the island, a longtime target of US imperial aggression, has suffered rolling blackouts due to oil shortages, a side effect of the action designed to destabilize Cuban society. In fact, Trump himself admitted to this, saying, "There will be no more oil or money going to Cuba. Zero. I strongly suggest they make a deal before it is too late." Mexico, under pressure from the US government, despite what it claims, and also possibly looking to gain benefits for themselves through cooperation with the imperial hegemon, has also stopped selling oil to the Cuban government. Lastly, I predicted that the shrinking of the American empire's influence would lead to the reshoring of capitalist class contradictions, bringing imperial violence once confined to Africa, Asia, and Latin America home into the good old US of A. And this too has happened. Most obviously, the recent extrajudicial execution of US citizens by the occupying military police in Minnesota and other US cities. That, in typical American fashion, is completely ignoring the deaths and the injuries of immigrants in ICE detention camps, as well as the resulting damages from forcing refugees to return to the countries they are seeking asylum from. But it is an unprecedented escalation, as white US citizens were previously seen to be protected from the violence of ICE agents. These developments, though temporarily easing in the wake of community actions in Minnesota, will continue and expand, likely moving to include not only immigrants of various statuses, as well as those profiled as immigrants, but also critics of the US regime, labeled communists and/or terrorists, depending on which is more advantageous for the narrative being constructed. Another development we've seen recently that will no doubt be wielded to great effect is the use of AI-manipulated and outright generated videos being used to justify extrajudicial killings. Speaking of AI, let's pivot from what we talked about before and towards what's next. Over the last year, money has been pouring into AI development. In 2025, Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft, and Meta invested $364 billion in the construction of AI infrastructure, on top of the $325 billion the year before. The US government has also announced that it will be pouring an additional $500 billion into AI infrastructure. The sums involved in this industry are so large that, according to Deutsche Bank, investment in AI-related sectors is critical to GDP growth, and the US would be close to recession this year if it weren't for tech-related spending, as other spending has flatlined post-COVID. While exact figures are hard to come by, it's clear that AI and AI-related investments are among the primary drivers of economic growth in the US, and have been for years at this point. This is of course due to the speculation that AI tools have the potential to replace human labor, historically the largest expenditure for all companies under capitalism. Indeed, many large companies have been able to substantially reduce their workforce thanks to AI, with Amazon alone laying off 30,000 employees in the past 2 quarters. Whether or not this can be applied to all, or even most, human labor remains far from proven, but at this point, it is clear that many jobs can and are indeed being eliminated by AI. Thanks to this trend, the companies involved in the creation of the infrastructure for AI tools have put it all on the line, taking out massive amounts of debt to fund their projects. Oracle, to fund the $500 billion venture with the US government, has issued $18 billion in bonds, one of the largest corporate debt sales in tech history. Financial analysts also estimate that the company will need to raise $20 to $30 billion annually by selling debt for the next 3 years to sustain this infrastructure investment. This would bring its debt-to-income ratio to 4 times, double that of industry peers Amazon and Microsoft. All this, and Oracle is only going to be leasing this infrastructure to one user, OpenAI. OpenAI, while being valued at $500 billion, is not and has never turned a profit. That was a lot of stock bro jargon to say that much of this AI infrastructure investment, one of the pillars of the US economy for years and drawing White House support, is a house of cards built on debt and circular dependency. OpenAI's success depends on Oracle's infrastructure, which is funded by unprecedented amounts of debt. In turn, Oracle's financial stability depends on OpenAI's ability to pay, and OpenAI has yet to even turn a profit once, mostly due to its own ridiculously large debts to investors. While this is the most egregious example, similar issues are present right across the entire AI sector. In layman's terms, the US capitalist class has essentially wagered the largest part of the US economy on a bet that AI is what your grandpa thinks it is, a full-scale replacement for humans in all economic roles, top to bottom. Basically anything short of that, and someone in the industry will default on their debts, beginning a chain of dominoes that will collapse the entire sector, and many others with investments in or related to it. This kind of thing should sound familiar, as it is more or less the same issue that caused the 2008 Great Recession. Forbes, famous for its technological fluency and high valuation of human labor, puts the odds of some sort of large-scale economic downturn in the near future at 60%. Even in the best-case scenario of AI suddenly becoming profitable overnight though, notorious commie spooks, the US Congress, predict that class divides will become increasingly stark in the near future. If there is an economic downturn though, the working class will on top of that be hit hardest, as research has shown happens in every economic downturn. Whether or not Sam Altman and Larry Ellison tank the US economy though, labor will continue to be laid off, unemployment will rise, and the middle classes will shrink as job openings become scarcer and small businesses fail. No substantial efforts are likely to be made by private industry or the government to alleviate this poverty, though it is quite likely the growing reserve army of labor will be targeted for recruitment in organizations of imperial violence, such as the US military and ICE. One of the few upsides of these gloomy prospects is the reemergence of class consciousness in the US, and an uptick in organizations designed to conduct class war. While the US is still miles behind practically any other country in this regard, it is continuing to trend in a positive direction. We're watching in real time as the class stratification of the economic base leads to a superstructural reawakening of class consciousness. Organizations linked to and in the mold of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense and the American Indian Movement, long considered dormant in national politics, have begun to re-emerge in response to ICE escalation. Revolutionary left-wing parties are larger and stronger than any time since the 70s, and have been coordinating more and more closely in response to the ongoing ICE escalation and acts of US imperialism across the globe. Real working-class resistance is finally re-emerging in the US, but that does unfortunately set the stage for an intensification of class warfare on the part of the ruling class. Measures will be taken, whether through ICE repression, targeting by other quote-unquote law enforcement groups, or private sector pressure to smother this movement in its cradle. Progressive groups will increasingly be targeted by infiltrators and disruptors. Violence against them will be encouraged and enabled, and their means of communication will be disrupted. Democrats will also attempt to co-opt and channel this revolutionary energy into the quagmire of ruling class electoral politics. This must be resisted. Not just the Democratic Party, but also the electoral system itself is designed from the ground up to kill revolutionary fervor. Do not get distracted. Do find a left-wing organization in your community and join it. DSA, PSL, FRSO, RCA, the Black Lions, AIM, whatever. The class struggle is at a point that factional divides are hypothetical, and all of these groups, among others, have been working together to resist ruling class aggression. Do arm yourself only in the bounds of the law and learn to use it. Get to know your neighbors and do what you can to support each other. Mutual aid groups like Food Not Bombs are also useful for this. Read theory, especially modern theory. When the class struggle progresses presses to the point that decisions must be made instantaneously, you'll wish you had already done the reading. So what does all of this mean for the rest of the world? Well, as I speculated in my last video, it does seem that Trump is going to be ceding ground to Russia in an effort to drive a divide between them and China. Trump and Putin have set up and engaged in the first direct negotiations since the war began, something that the US has been conspicuously avoiding until now. I still don't foresee this leading to a rift developing between China and Russia though, not only for the reasons I gave before, but also because the US's commitment to backing the occupying entity in Peninsula to the hilt directly threatens Russian interests in the region, specifically in Iran. Iran has deepened ties with Russia significantly in the last few years, while the US, on behalf of the occupying entity, has dramatically escalated its imperialist efforts to supplant the current Iranian government. This, as well as much of the US's recent imperialism, is being done to control the global oil market. All the targets we've discussed thus far, Iran, Russia, Canada, Venezuela, Mexico, and Colombia, are major oil-producing economies. This, I think, isn't being done to simply steal and sell the oil, however, but to control the price of oil itself. You see, all those targeted countries, plus the US itself, the world's largest oil producer, and its puppet regimes like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Nigeria, Qatar, and Oman, make up 3/4 of the top 20 oil-producing countries in the world. The US is trying to exert control over as many oil producers as possible because it wants to gatekeep who has access to that oil. Partly because the US government is bought and paid for by oil tycoons, though they would have you think otherwise, and partly because US hegemony is built on the fact that so many other countries don't have the developed economic and political infrastructure needed to separate their economies from the US. Oil is a huge component of that because its derivatives are a necessary component in many industrial processes, as well as their most readily available source of energy to underlie the development of new industries and electrical grids. So, if the US can control the global oil market by means of an imperial monopoly, it can make it harder for developing countries to access that oil, and make it harder for their economies to build themselves an independent future. Will this strategy work though? No, I don't think so, for a few reasons. First, the last quarter of those top 20 oil-producing countries are dominated by China, Brazil, and Norway, all major producers with good reasons not to comply, and China, at least, has the military and political might to defend that decision, but also because, due to massive Chinese state investment, clean energy technologies like solar are actually now cheaper than oil. Not only that, but China itself is blessed with an overabundance of the rare earth elements needed to create green technology, as well as a near monopoly on the industry that refines those elements into usable forms. Again, thanks to massive state investment. That means that even if the US is able to secure its imperial monopoly over global oil markets, the relevance of that oil is in rapid decline. China has already begun the transition to green energy, and still retains a very large domestic oil production industry. This means that as the US monopolizes oil, China will only be lightly affected, and also be able to undercut US prices when selling to the rest of the world. Not only that, but its clean energy technology and near monopoly on the materials used to make it will be almost untouchable to the US, and can allow developing countries to skip the oil stage entirely. As this process plays out, it will lay bare which global superpower is fighting against the progress of the world to preserve its own unfair position of advantage with blood, and which is willing to engage with others more or less as equals, preserving economic and political stability. This will push the rest of the world increasingly away from the US and towards China. Perhaps the most iconic symbol of this shift is the US's brother country, Canada's, recent trade deal with China against the insistence of Trump's administration. Similar things are and will continue to happen in Europe as well, and the US will eventually only have two cards left to play. First, gatekeeping access to its consumption markets. Though the US's social democracy is rapidly collapsing, artificial currency inflation and oversized middle classes do still lead to a rather large market for consumer goods in the US. Trump has used this in international relations as a bargaining chip, putting tariffs on countries he thinks aren't cooperating the way he'd like them to, so as to restrict their access to that consumption market. As class divides in the US continue to worsen, though, this tactic will be less and less effective, as average Americans have less and less money to spend overall. I mostly bring this up because it allows me to discuss the media strategy that the Trump administration used with these tariffs, and seems to be replicating in many of its other communications. Namely, they'll say or do one thing that is a flagrant and dramatic escalation, like the Liberation Day tariffs, or the shooting of US citizens by ICE in January this year, and then immediately step it back, quietly ramping it back up again in the background, and moving on to another flagrant and dramatic escalation. The Liberation Day tariffs, for example, caused a market crash, but then they immediately announced a 90-day pause before later implementing the tariffs again country by country. Here's how this media strategy works. The initial thing happens, shifts the Overton window far to the right, which then provokes resistance and backlash as the news cycle begins to cover it. Then, before that resistance and backlash can culminate in any real threat to power, they claw it back, putting a pause on the tariffs or placing the ICE pigs on administration leave or whatever. This not only pushes the initial thing out of the news cycle, but also throws a bone to the opposition to make them feel like something has been accomplished before demands have even been come to yet. Then, the news cycle moves on to something else, likely another evil thing that the Trump admin is doing, and the initial thing that caused the backlash in the first place, tariffs or shootings or whatever, can be brought back quietly without any new backlash. This is yet another reason why standing working class organizations are important, because they allow for rapid response from a group with pre-existing demands before the news cycle can be manipulated. Keep an eye on that. Anyways, the very last card the US will have to play is that of military aggression. The US still has the largest and most advanced military on the planet, with plans being laid for even more expansion. But even if it plays that card and begins World War III, the propaganda war has already been won. The world has moved past the US, and military force will be met with overwhelming opposition. Regardless of how many people the US takes down with it, it will eventually fall. That much is inevitable. The question is whether that fall will be long, drawn out, bloody, and apocalyptic, or if it will be smoothly handled. We're currently barreling headlong towards the former, but it doesn't have to be that way. Mass working class organization and resistance to the policies of the regime, coordinated nationally and defended by force from state repression, can spare the world that fate. Now is the time for those organizations to be built. Now is the time for that resistance to be planned, for those mutual defense organizations to be armed, equipped, and trained. Now is the time to get involved, for your future, for your family's future, and for the future of the working classes around the world. So what are you waiting for? Get out there, and don't forget to stay radical.
If you're new to this, let me know how I did. Does this make any sense at all, or are you more confused than you were before? If you're old to this, let me know what you think I missed, and leave your reading recommendations in the comments. If you've somehow made it to the end of this monster video, and would like to see more communist content, please negate the algorithm's distaste for progressive revolutionary content by liking and subscribing, and maybe tossing a link or two to a bud. Preach.